made a brutal political calculation that they would have more support from their far-right base here in Canada and in Russia and their friends in the United States than if they would abandon Ukrainians. Cold, calculated, cruel. Behold, Mr. Speaker, the new Conservative Party and their MPs. What a disgrace.
What's disgraceful and cruel is using Ukraine's vulnerability while Russian tanks are on its soil to shove a carbon tax permanently down their throat.
Domestic debate over an international trade deal. Earlier this week, the Tories voted against an updated Canada-Ukraine free trade agreement over carbon tax wording, they say. As you heard there, the government shot back, accusing the Tories of importing anti-Ukraine politics from the U.S. far right. Earlier on the program, I asked Ukraine's ambassador to Canada about the free trade deal. Have a listen.
You know, we respect the difference in mind with the different political parties in Canada. In the same point, we really value this united support for Ukraine.
Let's bring in the front bench to talk about this. Former BC Premier Christy Clark is here. She's a senior advisor with Bennett Jones. CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair is with us, as is the Toronto Star's Stephanie Levitz. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Steph, I'll start with you. What do you think is informing, or what's your sense of what's informing the Conservatives' position? Is it truly about the carbon tax and the party's opposition to it in all its forms, or is it being informed at all by the divide we do see on the far right in the U.S.?
To a degree, you know, why Mr. Poilievre is so beloved by his party and by his caucus is that he doesn't waver from his ideological positions or his policy positions on certain things. It takes a lot to push him to change his mind on something. And you can see a world in which, no matter how slight and how passing and how vague the reference is to carbon pricing in this free trade deal, you can see a world in which somebody who opposes him, if he votes in favor of this deal, seizes on that language and says, haha, look, you're in favor of carbon pricing. You're in favor of carbon pricing. And it ties him into a political pickle because he has made it clear he is not in favor of carbon pricing. And so is it about that ideological rigidity that he is not in favor of carbon pricing? Although I should say that we don't actually know whether Mr. Poilievre would cancel industrial carbon pricing. He's been very clear on the consumer carbon tax, not necessarily on the industrial one. Or is it about this growing faction of folks, still small but big in the United States, who are saying it's enough with our support to Ukraine? But this bill isn't about that. This bill is about free trade, a thing that Conservatives hold on to, and they hold quite dearly. So you have to imagine it's not about the question of arms support to Ukraine, the allocation of resources for Ukraine. It is about a specific part in free trade agreements that Poilievre believes should not be ideologically motivated, as he's accusing the Liberals of trying to do. So let's take the Tories at their word then for a second, Tom, for example, on this, and that it is about their ideological stance on the carbon tax, which they've been quite clear on, as Steph points out. And public opinion polling shows, particularly over the last few months with what happened with the home heating oil, that their argument has had some resonance. Do you think, though, the argument is diluted at all in the context of this vote in particular and a free trade agreement with a country like Ukraine at war with Russia?
I think that it's the latter. If you go back the last 30 years, the first international free trade agreement that had a whole chapter to deal with the environment was Canada, U.S., Mexico. Why? The Americans didn't have that great a view of the environment. They affirmed that Mexico didn't have enough environmental rules. And one of the things that you could do under the NAFTA was look at whether or not countries had rules and they were enforcing them. And that's where it started. This is what this is about. International trade deals now talk about these issues. They talk about whether or not you protect foreign investors. They talk about open markets, but they also talk about the environment. There's nothing nefarious about this. And I do find that there is an ideological bent here. If you look at the Republicans in the United States, the ideological brethren of Mr. Poilievre and some of his gang, there's no question in my mind that they're leaning away from helping Ukraine. And yes, I find it a shame because Canada has stood foursquare with Ukraine, and I think we were right to do so.
Christy, what's your sense? Do you think that there is some of that waning support informing this? Do you think it's about the carbon tax? What do you think?
Well, I agree with Tom in this part, which is it's absolutely true. These kinds of statements are very common in trade agreements, and they should be there. But the thing is, in this agreement, as it was passed, there is no requirement that that Ukraine have a carbon tax. It's just not in there. It is completely made up and then grabbed out of the blue for ideological reasons. It's not in there. They are going to have to negotiate some kind of a carbon tax regime as part of joining the EU, which they very much want to do. It's not going to be our role. It's not even in the agreement. I think this has been a massive blunder on the part of the Conservative Party. I think going out on a domestic political argument, really to make an argument that it isn't even there, and then seeming to defeat a trade deal with Ukraine in the midst of this terrible war against the Russian invasion is going to cost them politically, because I think most Canadians believe we have a moral obligation to support Ukraine. This is not America. I think Canadians' views on this are quite different. And to be voting against the trade deal on the basis of really what was a poison pill the Trudeau government put into the agreement, I think swallowing that pill and looking like we're not interested in supporting Ukraine is going to have a real political cost for the Conservatives, and it was a big blunder.
It's interesting because the wider political context is, for so long, Steph, and you'll know this as well as I do, we've been covering the Hill over the past number of months, 6 months even, and it's been the Liberals constantly reacting to stuff that the Tories put out there, right? They've really been on the defense. This is the first week in a long time that I can remember where the converse almost appears to be true.
Yeah, it's true. And also, I should argue substantively, which is to say this isn't about necessarily something that Mr. Poilievre said in a speech that the opposition seizes on, or something that a backbench member of Parliament did out in the world and the government seizes on. This is about a decision that Mr. Poilievre made on a piece of legislation that the government is challenging him on and trying to get him to defend. And not just him. I mean, if you think about some of where the support comes from for the Conservative Party in terms of their members of Parliament and in terms of the Ukrainian diaspora, ridings that are like 50, 60, 70% Ukrainian, you have to imagine there's some hard questions coming into members of Parliament's offices as saying, hey, what did you just do here? And you could see that in some of the committee study on the bill, where every single Conservative member of Parliament opened up their remarks with, I promise I support Ukraine. I promise this isn't about, this isn't about our support for Ukraine. We support Ukraine. But at the same time, a criticism that the Liberals have also been lobbying across at the Conservatives, which they haven't answered to yet, is the question of where do the Conservatives stand on military support for Ukraine? Where do they stand on defense spending? Where are they really on this commitment to 2% of GDP spending under NATO? It's not something they talk about that often, if ever. And it's a criticism that's sort of forcing them, again, into a place where they don't want to talk about, because it's not about the economy.
And they've been so disciplined and with a lot of success, Tom, on focusing on the economy. We've spoken about that on this panel multiple times. I think it was you and Christy in previous iterations of the panel who said, like, they have to be ready for when the topics do change, right? Because eventually there will be some topic changes, to Steph's point, in this case, very much directed around foreign policy.
It's been a superb lesson in message discipline. Anyone who's ever practiced the art of politics has to admire the extent to which Poilievre can impose message discipline on his troops. It's been remarkable. But I agree with Steph. The wheels have started to come off this week. Out of nowhere, an unbelievable own goal by Poilievre yesterday, standing up and affirming as a fact that the explosion of a car, pulling a Fast and Furious at the border, was a terrorist attack. Where did he even get that? He's got really amazing staff around him. And they would have certainly put their hand on his shoulder before CUPE and said, boss, don't go there. We don't have, it has to be a terrorist attack. Boss, we don't have the information yet. Trudeau was superb. Tone, absolutely perfect. They sent out Dominique Leblanc to do some of the rounds on the panel shows, especially on the French side. I've never seen him do better. So this was something that's going to drag. It hurts his credibility. And, it's a head scratcher. But anybody, I spent more than 10 years, face to face with Poilievre in the House. This is the type of stuff that he does. He just decides that he knows better than everybody else, and he's just going to go with it. And it's been one of those weeks. They're going to have to get back to the very disciplined ones that, again, those of us who have been in politics admire, even though we might not agree with their policies. It's very easy to admire the discipline and the way that they've been doing politics, because it's been very effective.
Christy, I'll give you the last word on that, because like Tom says, it has been very disciplined. It has been effective if you look at public opinion polling. But this week just seemed out of course.
It did. The whole week was a mess for them, as Tom has said. And I at the end of the day, people look at the big picture, not the little picayune issues that you're raising. I mean, although carbon tax is major, but I always think that character is the single most important thing that people look at in politics, and I think the Ukraine issue is a character-defining issue for politicians in our country, which is why everybody's been so supportive when President Zelensky came and visited, and some other opportunities to kind of back away from Ukraine over an issue that is entirely domestic and isn't even in the agreement is quite a bit. I think it's totally out of character for Poilievre to make that kind of blunder, but he's done it.